One of the final topics that we cover in the way I approach philosophy these days is metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Well, if you've heard the word, you either have heard of a little bit of philosophy, or you may have a actually bad sense of what this word means. In the 90s, in the early 2000s, metaphysics was a term that was used for kind of spiritual, charmed kind of things. If you knew the TV series Charmed back in the early 2000s and I think 90s too. Metaphysics simply meant after physics. It was the book in Aristotle. Aristotle lived in the 300s BC. In Aristotle, in the collections of his work, there was a book on the physics, which is about nature and natural kinds of things. It's kind of a science book. And then the book after the physics was about the stuff of reality. What is the ultimate reality? And so metaphysics originally simply was the book after the physics, and it asked questions like, what is really real? Is this table in front of me real? Am I really sitting in a room here? What is reality? And in the past, sometimes I played a clip from The Matrix, which is now a very old movie, but where it turns out in that movie, he's not in New York City in the 1990s. He's actually a couple centuries later. His body is in some kind of a tub where I think it's robots are kind of sucking the life from his and everybody else's body, and that their mind is actually in a matrix. And he realizes that what he sees is not actually what's real. So the topic of metaphysics in philosophy asks, what is actually real? What is the stuff that reality is made of? Now, this can seem really irrelevant. In fact, although logically you might ask questions like these first, I usually these days postpone it till the end of philosophy, because a lot of times it's one of those like, man, philosophy is a waste of my time. But it is actually significant. But let's dig in, shall we? So, what is this? What are the debates over metaphysics? So here are kind of two big options in the history of the world. So there have been those who've said matter is what is real. And if you take this really to the ultimate, then there is a kind of philosophical materialist who would say the physical world is all there is. There's nothing more. And so this was especially common in the last couple hundred years, of people they didn't believe in God, they didn't believe in angels, they didn't believe in a spiritual realm. Basically, the physical world to them is all there is. And this is a materialist. Now, you may have heard the word materialism as in someone, I just love to going to Stuff Mart. I want to buy stuff. Buy, Timo. But that's not what materialism means generally in this area of philosophy. Materialism, in this context, are those who think, or a materialist is somebody who believes that matter is all she wrote. Now, that's a very common kind of Western approach to things. Although, you do increasingly find people who would say, well, trust the Force, Luke. There's something spiritual, that's out there that's beyond what we can see or observe. There are a lot of people today who would say, well, I'm not sure that the idea of God makes sense to me, but I believe that there's a spiritual dimension. And this is, of course, where the New Age movement and the kind of spiritualism of the 90s and 2000s kind of came in, where it's kind of like, well, they weren't sure that there was a personal God, but they did kind of believe that there were spirits, or they did kind of believe that there was another dimension to reality, something that went beyond what you can see. They might even say, yes, prayer works, not because there's a God answering them, but because there is a spiritual realm that can be manipulated. And so I just want to make it clear, that's not the normal way of understanding the word metaphysics in philosophical circles. That's a knockoff, a cultural spin-off of what is a long-standing, very respectable debate in Christian philosophy even. And some people don't know this. I didn't read the book, but I dabbled in a book called New Age versions of the Bible. It came out about 25 years ago, 25 years ago. And this book, the author may be very intelligent, but she has a note in there where she says, this guy named Hort used to like to go for strolls in the evening and talk metaphysics. She's like, he's obviously an evil person who believes in demons in the spirit world. Apparently, this author didn't know. Metaphysics is a topic in philosophy that's been around since the 300s. I'm pretty sure that this English British scholar was talking philosophy, not about spirit guides. Anyway, it was kind of funny to me and kind of sad at the same time. Anyway, not important right now, just adding a little flavor to the video. So materialism, I think we understand that this physical world around us, I won't bang on my desk because then my dogs will bark. But that there is a physical world, we all kind of think that. We relate less to idealism. Idealism, though, has had a long and a prestigious history. Plato was an idealist in the, again, 300s BC. An idealist is someone who thinks that ideas are what are really real. Now, there are very few people who would go full-on Plato today. But there are a lot of us who act as if the ideas are more real than the physical world around us. Plato believed that the physical world was a shadow of the real world that we contemplated with our mind. And although it's easy to make fun of Plato, Platonism is a deeply influential approach within Christian circles, especially. In fact, if I remember Francis Schaeffer's "How Should We Then Live," a very, very, very influential watershed book in the, I think, 1970s, he basically said, if I read him right, that everything kind of that isn't idealist is a perversion of Christianity, and a lot of his area of Christianity basically would say, if you can get your ideas straight, the rest of your life will fall into place, which I don't actually think is the way it usually works. It'd be nice. I mean, in theory, that's a great theory, but people do what they want to do. People manipulate their ideas. I don't know if you've seen the second Spider-Man with Dr. Octopus, where there's this chip that's supposed to keep his arms from taking over his brain, and it gets broken and his arms take over his brain, and it's kind of the way it is, I think, with our guts, with our impulses, and with our drives. You'd like to think that our mind is controlling what we think, but I think usually it goes the other way around, that our arms, our octopus arms are actually, and Jonathan Haidt, you might remember in this series of conversations, talked about a rider on an elephant, where the rider is our reason and the elephant is our urges and our impulses and our drives and the cultural impact on us and all that stuff. And the elephant's going to go where it wants to go. And the rider says, yeah, I really wanted to go this direction, even though the elephant's really deciding where to go. Idealism is the idea that pure idealism, such as George Berkeley believed in the 1700s, I think. Berkeley would say that we are all thoughts in the mind of God, that there is no matter per se that is different from the ideas that are in God. By the way, I'm not sure how we know the difference. How would you know the difference between whether this table is an ideal table or whether this table is a material table? And that kind of gets us to it gets us to the next slide, not this slide, but on the next slide, I'm going to talk about kind of an aha moment that a particular philosopher had when he basically said, I really don't know this table as a table. I can't get into the table. The table is something different from me, and I experience this table in here. I can't get into the table. I don't know. I don't know whether out-of-the-body experiences are real. I kind of doubt it. Paul in 2 Corinthians says, I don't know whether I was in or out of the body when I went up into the third heaven. Anyway, sidetrack. I can't really get into the table. I only experience this table as it comes to me. And so this particular philosopher's name is Immanuel Kant. He's on the next slide. He basically said, we don't know the world as it is. We know the world as we experience it, we know it as it appears to it. We know it as a phenomena, as an appearance, as a being experienced. I don't know the table in itself. Hi, table. Nice to meet you. But I just know. So is this table an idea? Is this table matter? I experience it as something that is different from me. I experience it as something that's solid, and basically, slightly taking him out of context. There was a 20th century philosopher named Wittgenstein who he said, what we can't say about, we shouldn't talk about. Wherever you cannot speak, you must be silent. That was his final point in one of his books. And it's kind of like, I can't really say what this table is, whether it's matter or idea, and what would the difference be? And so, I just know there's a table here, or I'm willing to believe that. That's on another slide too. Critical realism. The world is real, even though my experience out of it is colored by my finiteness, my finitude, and my flawed fallenness. A lot of F's there. Finitude, finite, fallen, flawed. Anyway, so in a sense, Kant said, he wrote a book, said, a prolegomena to any future metaphysic. Prolegomena is the things you say before you say something. And so he said, before you talk about metaphysics, I have a few things to point out. And what he pointed out was, we can't really talk about metaphysics because we can't know the world in itself, or in German, das Ding an sich. We can't know the thing in itself. We just can only know it as it comes to us, as we experience it. Okay, I've gotten ahead of myself. Maybe that means that the future slides won't take as much time. What I want to say now is that in the past there have been idealists, there have been materialists. Most Christians, I would say, are dualists, not as in en garde, dualists, not that kind of dualist, different kind of dualist. A dual as in two, dynamic duo. And that is, most of us believe that we have both a body or a physical dimension, and that there's also a spiritual dimension. Now, I'm not going to be real prescriptive in what exactly that means, because to me, these are pictures, right? These are pictures that express a truth about the world. And we try to come up with pictures, with metaphors, with language, so I have a body that I can see. And then I believe there is a dimension to the world that we can't exactly see most of the time, a spiritual dimension. It is kind of the dimension that explains why things happen that go against the laws of nature, which I call miracles. God is not material. God doesn't have a body, except as Jesus. As Jesus, he has a body. But in terms of before he came as Jesus, in terms of 2 Corinthians 4 says God is a spirit. Those who worship God have to worship him in spirit. Because we can't go, we go to church, but it's not like God has managed to fit us into his schedule this morning, and here he is, and there's a physical being. I think I would be very scared if someone said that this large, giant, physical entity in front of you is God. I think I would probably leave pretty quickly, if somebody said that at a church somewhere or somewhere else, So most of us believe that there are at least two kinds of stuff. There may be 1,000, 1,000,000, an infinite amount of kinds of stuff. I don't know. It's above my pay grade. So it's more of a what you call a heuristic method, or a working hypothesis, that there is the bodies that we can see and detect, and then there is this other realm that, at least at the moment, we can't really measure it or detect it exactly. It's something different. And so that's a metaphysic that believes in two fundamental kinds of reality. And I think that's probably where most of us as Christians are. All right. Epistemology, or how do I know that I know what I think I know, was a previous discussion. But I think debates over epistemology is very relevant to metaphysics, because the problem of how do we know what's real says something about what we can say about what's real, right? Let me explain. So epistemology, again, is the question, how do you know that you know what you think you know? And there were two main paths beginning around the year 1600 You had a lot of people who were uncertain about a lot of things. You'd had the Protestant Reformation had basically blown up the Roman Catholic Church as the authority. You now had Lutherans running around, you had Calvinists running around, you had Anabaptists running around, and more to come, right? Tens of thousands more to come. And so there was real uncertainty. The Bible, far from providing certainty to now we know what's real because we're going back to the Bible, it had the opposite effect. You had this interpretation, that interpretation, that interpretation, and actually there was far less certainty about what was true spiritually after the Protestant Reformation than there was before. Because before the Protestant Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church, it told you what was right. So there's all this uncertainty. Anyway, so you have these thinkers trying to say, well, how do I know that I know what I think I know? And you had Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. He basically said it's reason. Reason is the way to truth. If I can think of something clearly, distinctly, then it's true. And so you had the rationalists. And then you had the empiricists. So Francis Bacon, he comes up with the scientific method. Let's go outside to find truth. Let's observe things. Let's create a list. This evidence supports this hypothesis. This evidence doesn't, and then we test it and we test it and we test it and we observe with our senses and we come up with a theory, and we test the theory, and eventually we say this is a natural law, or whatever. But there's a whole stream of empiricism. John Locke is the one that really, if Francis Bacon was kind of the father of the scientific method, you have John Locke, who kind of creates what's called empiricism as a philosophy. That is, that my senses, not my reason, but my senses are the path to truth. There's nothing on my brain that wasn't first in my senses, Locke would say. He talked about my brain being a blank slate, a tabula rasa, on which my experiences write. And so John Locke, George Berkeley, David Hume, these individuals would all say it's through the senses that is our path to truth. But then you had Rene Descartes and Gottfried Leibniz and Baruch Spinoza, who were all saying, no, reason is the path to truth. Now, David Hume, this empiricist that I mentioned in the 1700s, he was a nice little Scottish bloke, very, very agnostic, it seems to me. But David Hume basically said, I can't really experience time. I can experience this moment. There, I experienced that moment. Oh, I experienced another moment. He says, and I can't really experience cause effect. I can experience fist coming, fist coming, fist coming, fist coming, fist coming, hit. But I can't experience the law that says, that really is coming from stitching that I glue together that isn't actually experience. And a guy by the name of Immanuel Kant that I mentioned on the previous slide, I think it was, this kind of shook him from his dogmatic slumber, he said. Like, get a life, man. You're sitting around worried about these things. Anyway, that's what some people think. But Immanuel Kant basically said, what if the content of what I think comes from my senses, from my experiences, but that the structure of my thought comes from this software, this neat mind software, this Minecraft that God has put into my head. And so, he said basically God has put into my head cause-effect software and moral law software and space-time software. And basically, Kant said, as I said in the previous slide, we don't experience the world as it is. We experience it as our software puts it together. Our minds have built-in. It's like Microsoft Word, right? You can't tell Microsoft Word, make me a ducky. That's not what it does. There are rules that are built into Microsoft Word, but I can type. And so that's kind of like our situation with knowledge, Kant would say, that the software is built in and created by God. And there, by the way, he said, and since God did it, we can depend on it. Kant was not we don't know what's going on. That really wasn't the flavor of Kant. It was just that, no, there are rules that God has put in here that shape the way our senses input things. But it also led Kant to this idea that we can't know things in themselves. We only know them as our minds process them. And so he wrote this book, as I said, a prolegomena to future metaphysic, any future metaphysic, basically saying we can't really talk about what the table is as a table. Das Ding an sich, das Tisch an sich, the table in itself. Actually, I think it's der Tisch. Not important. German debates, but German grammar. But I can't know the table as it is. I can only know the table as I experience it. So, is this table matter? Is this table an idea? That's almost an irrelevant question, Kant would say, because I don't experience the table qua table. I experience the table as my mind processes it. And so there is a sense in which, what are you saying, Ken? Are you saying that I'm watching this video? I've been watching this video for almost 20 minutes now, and there are no answers to metaphysics? Is that what you're telling me, Ken? Well, a little bit. but basically, the approach that I think makes the most sense is what's called critical realism. It is, on the one hand, realism. It believes that the world is real. It believes that there is truth. There are right and wrong answers, or at least more right and less right answers, but it's critical. I'm stuck in this head. I am finite. Believe me, anybody who knows me will tell you, yeah, Ken, he's really limited. Not only am I finite, but I'm also fallen. The sins of Adam and Eve have kind of brought down our ability to think as well as we sometimes think we are. And I know I'm going to have to wear a dunce cap in heaven, for how stupid I am. But anyway, critical realism basically says the world outside us does exist. It makes sense, right? By all means, get out of the way of oncoming traffic. Don't jump off of tall buildings. Please, don't do it. I'm going to test whether I should jump off the Empire State Building. Don't do it. The world outside us is real. Our basic understanding of the world, it makes a lot of sense. However, our sense of the world is almost always affected by our finitude and by the fall. I mean, probably I should say it is always affected by our finitude and the fall. I mean, there are some things that I think, something exists other than me. I don't know that the fall is affecting that statement that much, but as a rule, the world is real, truth is real, our sense of it is always affected, or almost always affected, or virtually always affected by our finitude, the fact that we're not infinite like God, we don't know everything. Man, we don't know everything. Man, we're nowhere close to God, but also that we're fallen. And that's critical realism. Now, there is another, I'll just as a footnote mention Richard Rorty. What is it? Something as the mirror of nature. But anyway, he basically would say what we might call pragmatic realism. That is that it's not so much that things are true or that things correspond to the world. It's that some understandings work better than others. I'm not quite that pessimistic, to be honest. I do believe that we can know the world as it is a little bit. There used to be a professor at Indiana Wesleyan University where I used to teach, Dr. Martin. He used to point out that even though 1 Corinthians 13 says, now we see through a mirror dimly, or in the King James, through a glass darkly. They didn't have really good mirrors back then. It's a mirror is not so if you think about how good the mirrors were in the first century, they weren't good. So we see through a bad mirror, as it were, a dim mirror, Paul says. But Dr. Martin would always follow up and say, but we do see. And I think that's, I like that it's not a complete pessimism. We do see some, but we should beware thyself, because your view of the world is always filtered through the glasses you're wearing. And most of the time, we don't even know we're wearing glasses, probably. So critical realism is kind of my approach to things. It is humbling. It is limiting, but it basically says I need to be humble. I need to have an epistemological humility as I approach serious questions. I don't think I need to tell you the classic scientific method, but I do want to mention in closing Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn you've probably heard the expression, I had a paradigm shift. That comes from Thomas Kuhn. And even though Francis Bacon came up with the scientific method, as it turns out, our finiteness and our finitude affects how you carry out the scientific method. It's none of us are objective entirely. Some of us are. I do believe that some of us are more objective than others. But what happens is that we don't realize. Like, for example, Bacon said you should start creating a table and tally up the evidence. But the problem is you don't see all the evidence. There might be evidence over here that's very important, but you're looking here. You're taking observations over here, and the most important observations are over here. And so there is no such thing as perfect objectivity. Spock is a myth. I mean, actually, Spock is a paradigm of the attempt of human objectivity, I think. But in practice, we're all going to fail. Again, some of us are more objective than others. I do think that's true. I think one of the things that I personally would hope you would get from a philosophy course is a commitment to try to be objective, to be a real seeker of truth, not someone who uses your intellect to try to shove the evidence into the pattern you want it to fit. But Thomas Kuhn basically said that science has a normality to it. And this is the way the book says. The textbook has said this for 200 years, or whatever. And so there is a kind of normal science. What often happens is, normal science wants to perpetuate itself. It's like, we've always done science this way, Of course, gravity is a force. Of course, gravity is a force. I think Einstein said gravity is really just the curvature of space due to mass. But in the late 20th century, I think they always talked about the four forces of nature, and they threw gravity in there. But is gravity really a force, or is gravity actually, the fact that I'm falling through space that's curved because of the mass? Anyway, normal science wants to perpetuate itself. When they thought that the sun went around the Earth, there was resistance to any different idea. Normal science wants to keep its normal pattern going. But inevitably, some data doesn't fit in our paradigm. There's always what I call naughty data. I use this phrase with regard to the Bible, that there are always, no matter what theological tradition you're from, there are verses that are like, what does that verse mean? And the other tradition says, well, I know what that verse means. And you're like, I sure hope it doesn't mean what you think it means. I call these naughty verses that don't fit in my denomination or my Christian tradition or my Christian theology. But in general, there's always naughty data that doesn't fit into my paradigm. Virtually always, I'll say, because who knows? Maybe there's an example where, like, for example, let's say I've collected data. I see a person, they have a head. I see a person, they have a head. I see a person, they have a head. Head, and I form a theory, a scientific theory that all people have heads. And then, spoiler or gross alert, then I discover, I come upon a really bad accident where a person has been decapitated. And then I have to modify my hypothesis a little bit. It's like, okay, every living person has a head. There may be some dead people that don't have heads, but every living person has a head. And who knows, maybe one day we'll find the headless horseman and we'll find out, hey, your brain is in your neck. How did that happen? I don't know. You scared a lot of people, though. And so naughty data would be like, oh, here's a body without a head. And so I have to modify my hypothesis. Or maybe I don't. Maybe I'm like, well, that was never a human. Humans can't lose their head. What are you, silly? You can't lose your head if you're a human. The normal scientists resist the naughty data. But there's usually, no matter what your paradigm is, there's usually naughty data that doesn't fit the paradigm. And so sometimes voices in science, they arise saying, you know what, there are other possibilities. What if this paradigm's wrong and we need to make a paradigm shift to think of it slightly differently? What if instead of the sun going around the earth, what if the earth goes around the sun? What about that? And usually there's resistance. Usually there's a power struggle. It's like, no, it doesn't. You're evil. Burn them. She's a witch. More witches. Burn more witches. But eventually, the older scientists may die off. Einstein never accepted quantum mechanics in the Copenhagen sense. But he's not here anymore to object. And so there can be a power struggle with eventually the older believers, may die off. There can be media, publication wars. Anyway, you often have paradigm shifts. They weren't as common in the past. Sometimes it took some time to get a paradigm shift. But these days, we kind of expect paradigm shifts all the time. But this is what Thomas Kuhn in his book in 1970s, I think it was actually first came out in the 1960s, I think, The Structure of Scientific Revolution. He argued that science isn't exactly, the I'm really smart, I'm a scientist, I know everything. Science does actually involve some glasses. And that the science as a sociological phenomenon, you have this kind of normal science that some creation scientists would say exactly that's what these evolutionists are. They're normal scientists. Even though, so Ken Ham would say, even though these evolutionists know that evolution has problems, they know the naughty data there, they're not going to change their mind. And of course, the evolution might say it's the other way around. The creation scientists won't change their mind, even though the evidence is clear. But anyway, a lot of times there is naughty data that doesn't fit in the predominant paradigm. Then you might have some other people suggesting, well, what if the paradigm is wrong? What if we change the paradigm? And the initial reaction is usually resistance. No, go away. You're evil, or at least no. We're not going to give you a job at our university because you don't believe the way we do. But that group may lose power. They may die off. There may be an asteroid hit the Earth, and it doesn't matter. But eventually, a lot of times, or sometimes, there's a paradigm shift. The older objectors retire, or the power struggle changes, and now you've got a new paradigm, and the whole thing starts all over again. This has been about, 30 minutes, almost 30 minutes, a little bit of a talk about metaphysics as we reach the end, if you've been with me on a philosophical venture. Metaphysics, everyone. May you have lovely philosophical thoughts for the rest of your life.